Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me in this session today. My name is Ghenis, and I'm the founder and president of the UBI Center. And I'm really excited to share with you some research that I've done with my colleagues Nikhil, Woodruff, and Charles Bauman, looking at how you can fund a UBI with a land value tax in the UK. A little bit about the UBI Center. So our mission is to make UBI the world's most thoroughly researched economic policy. And we do that through traditional think tank kind of reports. So we use microsimulation to simulate different tax and benefit reforms that can fund UBI. So we've done a few of these kinds of reports in the UK, ranging from relatively minor reforms like repealing the personal allowance. That's kind of like a standard deduction, basically a tax-free allowance. And you can fund roughly a £30 per week UBI through that. We've also looked at some proposals from the Liberal Democrats, the number 3 party in the UK, as well as some adjustments to those. And we've modeled also a more substantive kind of reform with essentially replacing the entire tax and benefit system with a 50% flat income tax, with surplus going to a UBI. So I think we've shown that there can be real progress made toward really a full UBI in the UK with normal tax and benefit reform. Although some of the challenges that you see with those kind of reforms are that you're really raising marginal tax rates on labor, and that's going to contract the economy to some degree. So we have another session in this Congress talking about that and doing some research on it. And land is one of the kinds of things you can tax that does not have that side effect. So that's a really, I think, compelling reason to research it, and that's what we've done in this report. So what I'll talk about is some of the history and practice of land value taxation, how we went about our simulation, our policy simulation, what we found, and then I'll close with some of the areas for future research and some of the lessons that we've learned in conclusion. All right, so land value tax. It really has a long history, so especially in the UK. So King Henry III, back in 1217, sealed the Charter of the Forest. As a child, he signed this, and this basically reestablished the rights of freemen to have access to the royal forest. So this followed William the Conqueror, really preventing people from having access to a resource that people really needed to sustain themselves. So it established this idea of land as the commons that can sustain individuals and moral motivation to share that. Thomas Paine then in 1797 published a book called Agrarian Justice, which proposed taxing land upon death. So once you die, the value of your land goes into the commons, and that funds a pension for people over 55 years of age, as well as one-time payments for 21-year-olds. So this kind of the baby bond idea before it was really called baby bonds. And then in 1879, this may be the most well-known source of land value tax thought is Henry George's Progress and Poverty, which proposed an annual tax on the unimproved value of land. So rather than just taxing it upon death, the idea is the value of land can change over time, so you want to capture that and share it with the commons every year. And it turns out because it is of a fixed supply, so compared to a labor tax, income tax, capital gains tax, corporate tax, all those things, those tax bases can respond to the tax. And because land can't respond in its supply, you can't stop producing land, or you can't reduce the amount of land based on the tax. It makes it non-distortionary. And as a result, economists see land value tax as one of the most efficient ways to raise revenue without reducing GDP per capita. And that's backed up by the OECD in this quote. The UK does not exactly have a land value tax today. It does tax residential property through a tax called the council tax. It taxes commercial property through business rates, and it taxes the transfer of property through the stamp duty. So none of those tax land exactly because they're really based on the full property value, including the value of the structure, but it is correlated to land value tax. So this is certainly not unprecedented. The land is essentially part of the tax base. And land is very valuable in the UK. It's estimated to be just over half of the total wealth in the UK, 5.7 trillion pounds. And that's a larger share of wealth than peer countries. Other areas around the world have a more direct land tax. For example, Victoria, Australia has a progressive land tax. So depending on the value of the land, you're going to pay a more, a higher marginal rate on that land. And this has a progressive element. It definitely avoids adding more of a tax burden to people who have low amounts of wealth, but it has a drawback of being distortionary. So when you have a progressive tax like this on something like land, you can effectively reduce the land tax by splitting lots. You can move land between family members. So there are ways to avoid it that don't really contribute to economic growth. And this is sort of a deadweight loss, just a waste of resources in avoiding taxation. Allentown, Pennsylvania, kind of goes on the other side. They have a flat 4% land tax. And this is more simple, more efficient. But the question remains, how do you make the result progressive? And as we've shown in our research, the answer is really the reason we're all at this Congress today. All right, so what we do, our simulation, we couldn't just go to a single data set and say, okay, all these people have this amount of land, so we can just tax it, simulate taxing it, and then see what the poverty rate is. We had to go to a few different data sources. So the one that's most common for poverty analysis, is the core of our analysis in other reports, is the Family Resources Survey. And that survey has a variety of income data, benefit data, and demographics, but it does not have attributes around wealth or land. There's another survey called the Wealth and Asset Survey, which does have wealth by asset, so corporate wealth, property wealth, as well as income and demographics, so things that are common to it and the Family Resources Survey. And then there's data from the Office of National Statistics, which captures land value by sector. So we were able to combine all these data sets to estimate the land for each person Family Resources Survey. And the way we did that is we first estimated the land value for households. So we've got the share of total land value by households compared to corporations and government. So about 2/3 of the wealth in the UK is held by households directly. And in the Wealth and Asset Survey, we have data on how much property wealth every household in that survey has. So we also have the amount of corporate wealth, things like stocks. And from those two features, we could estimate the total land value using a formula that sort of fits the data. And we end up with this 5.5 trillion estimate, which is the amount that's held by non-government entities based on the ONS data. We then fused this land value to the Family Resources Survey. So, in the Wealth and Asset Survey, we've got assets by type, debts by type, that all goes into our estimate of the land value. We also have data around income, household composition, things about the home, and that is all common to the Family Resources Survey. So using machine learning, because we have these similar characteristics across the two surveys, we were able to estimate the land value for every household in the Family Resources Survey. And we can now combine this with data around benefits, poverty status, as well as our whole tax and benefit microsimulation model to estimate the effect of the land value tax. All right, so our reform was pretty simple. We just put a 1% flat land value tax on the 5.5 trillion land value base. So that's going to raise 55 billion pounds, and divide that by all people. We're preserving all the existing taxes and benefits that are in the system today. So you end up with a £16 per person per week UBI that is funded by the 1% LBT. So the results of that are pretty interesting. If you just take the LBT, this actually surprised us a bit. A 1% LBT by itself is slightly regressive in terms of income. And I think we have some caveats for that, which I'll talk about in a minute. But basically the bottom decile, there are some people in the bottom decile who have a lot of land assets and they don't have income or much income. So as a result of that, they experience this more major drop in their income compared to people in the higher income deciles. So income inequality would rise about 1%. But once you take that revenue and you fund it into a UBI, this flips pretty dramatically. So instead of a 1% reduction or increase in inequality, now we have inequality falling 3%, and the average impact on the bottom decile, instead of falling about 8%, it's now rising over 12%. And all on average, the bottom 7 deciles come out ahead, and the top 2 have losses of under 2% of their income from the LVT. The reform would cut poverty also quite a bit, 16%, just from this £16 per person per week UBI. And it would be most stark on the child poverty side. So child poverty would fall almost a third. And pensioner poverty would rise very slightly as well. So I think this gets into another question of what happens if you have a larger LVT, a larger UBI. And it turns out that the poverty effects and inequality effects do continue to fall until you hit about 3–4% of an LVT. And then it starts to turn around. So why might this be? Well, I think this illustrates a challenge with assessing these kinds of reforms in terms of poverty rates, because if you think of the people who would be pushed into poverty as a result of a land value tax that's offset by a UBI budget neutrally, those people are going to be people with a fair amount of wealth. So it does mean that they could, if they were taxed on that wealth, they would have capital gains, and if they needed to sell some of that wealth to pay for the tax, they would accrue more income that isn't evident in the data. Also, there's a concept called imputed rents. So if you're renting a home and you're paying for that with, let's say, dividends from stock holdings you have, those dividends are counted as income. But if you're a homeowner and you're effectively paying rent, you're paying yourself rent through an asset that you own, which is your home, instead of some equities. That's called imputed rents, and it's not captured as part of the income data. So we had these two kind of things, these, first of all, estimating imputed rents, and also if we were able to estimate the amount of capital that people would sell to pay the tax, which by definition, if they have high land tax burden, they would have a lot of land. I think we would not see this kind of turnaround, and we'd see a more consistent reduction in the poverty rate from an LVT UBI. So some future research we're looking to do, we really want to improve this imputation. We feel pretty good about the results we shared, but for example, there are data on local conditions. We're looking just at the region level here, but there are lots of local governments that have varying council taxes and also varying land values. So we want to calibrate that so we can do more micro level analysis. We also want to integrate this into our micro simulation model of the UK tax and benefit system, which is called Open Fiscal UK. And that will enable other researchers to do these kinds of analyses with ease. We also want to project the response to taxation. So all the things I just talked about in terms of people potentially selling land as a result. Also, the land value is just going to mechanically fall when you start taxing it, because the value of the land is effectively the net present value of future after-tax rents, and that's going to fall if you increase the tax. We also want to incorporate the existing kind of pseudo land taxes that the UK has, because there's been a lot of discussion in the UK of replacing a council tax, business rates, stamp duty, potentially with a flat property rate tax, and a land value tax could be another option there as well. So in conclusion, I think there's a lot of evidence that land value taxation is not just morally just, as a lot of philosophers throughout history have shown. It's also highly efficient, and economists really do praise it even today. But by itself, it would increase poverty and inequality, at least the way we measure it today. So you really want to have a smart way of using the revenue to counteract that. And a UBI does make it progressive. Finally, I want to share, if there are economic modelers in the audience, we do make this Open Fiscal UK microsimulation model freely available. It's open source on GitHub. So if anyone is interested in using that, we'd be happy to partner and help you make future analyses like these happen. So with that, I'll leave it to my colleague, Nikhil Woodruff, for questions. Thank you so much.